Speakers. Number 1, lecturer. Ladies and gentlemen, today's lecture showcases a newly discovered phenomenon in the field of particle physics, which is destined inescapably to remain on the very cutting edge of modern scientific hypothesis for a very long time to come. The implications potentially have as hugely stunning consequences for the macrocosm as they do for the microcosm, let alone the microcosm. You would do well to put away your pencils and notebooks. I would encourage you to disengage entirely from your conventional modes of thought and deduction. In fact, I sincerely recommend you don't even think at all. You may well benefit from falling asleep and letting my words ooze into your subconscious for fermentation and later pondering. Indeed, I would go even further and recommend you leave the lecture auditorium now and at some point try to imagine what I am about to attempt to explain. Now, before we begin proper, I should warn you that we shall be covering areas of such devastating complexity that you must realize that you run the very real risk of dying as a result of contemplating what I am about to divulge. And in this regard, I've been asked to point out that the faculty hereby absolves itself from all legal and moral responsibilities and obligations should a life cessation incident occur as a result of this lecture. At the very least, there are likely to be nosebleeds, hence the all-over covering of plastic sheeting on your desks and attendant medical personnel you see lining the sides of the auditorium. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Now, last week in part 1 of this 2-part lecture, you may recall that we discussed, among other matters, the transformation of charged pions and antipions after decay into a muon plus antineutrino and an antimuon plus neutrino, and the photonic consequences of their interaction from the resultant average lifetime of 2.603 times 10 to the power of minus 8 seconds. And leading on from that, we naturally went on to place our extrapolated outcomes in a superstring theory context and investigated thoroughly the differences in number and type of dimensions envisaged respectively in both the clockwise and anti-clockwise vibrations of the heterotic string. And all this playful meandering served merely to prepare you for the idea of preparing yourselves to be prepared for the preparation to encounter that for which no one could ever be prepared. Not even me, and it is my discovery. I was not prepared for this discovery before I discovered it, and having discovered it, I still find myself totally unprepared for having discovered it. And the fact that I am unshaven, still in my pajamas, and my eyebrows are permanently arched is merely the tip of a very large iceberg, a very large, unprepared iceberg. In terms of the significance of this discovery, I do not believe I shall ever be prepared. It is now that things become a little convoluted. But first, let me say this. Forget your leptons. Reject your tachyons. Dump your quarks, be they up, down, strange, charm, top, bottom, thistle, fridge, or bugle. Furthermore, throw out your bosons, Higgs bosons or otherwise, you won't be needing them, not where we're going. Among other things, we are about to enter a world of the very small. How small? Think of something that is very small. A mouse, smaller. A pin, smaller. Half a pin, smaller. A woodlouse's penis, smaller. The hair on a woodlouse's penis, smaller. A piece of dandruff on the hair of a woodlouse's penis, much, much smaller than that. What we are about to envisionate, ladies and gentlemen, is in fact not only smaller than nothing at all, it is smaller than a negative amount. Smaller even than a negative amount, so small that it could be described as absolutely enormous. But for the purposes of this lecture today, it is very, very small. I am, of course, talking about the subject to the very nub and kernel of these lectures, my very latest discovery, the very ultimate building block of reality, which I have called Thing. And more about Thing in a little while, but it's at this stage that I'd like to fill in a little background to this discovery. I should like to introduce some personal context here, if you will indulge me. My interest in particle physics began when I was a very small child. And it was the fact that I was a very small child that led to this interest being awakened. For I was born with small child syndrome, an extremely rare genetic condition that affects only 1 in 60 children. I was born smaller than an atom by cesarean section. As you all surely know, the small child syndrome suffering small child spends 4 years and 2 months exactly at subatomic level before growing to mature adult height in the space of 20 to 25 minutes. I myself took nearly 26 minutes, but then I always was a late developer. But seriously, during the 4 years I spent at subatomic level before growing, I gained a natural affinity with that world. Protons were my friends. Neutrons weren't what you would call friends, but certainly I knew them to say hello to. Acquaintances, I suppose you'd call them. And before I left that world, I heard strange rumors and stories of a mysterious, undiscovered element in the canvas flap of reality. And I swore then that I would return there when I was older. Not literally, for I am now at 5'11", far too big, but using the tiny greyhound bus of my brain and intuition, I vowed to travel back to that which has never been made manifest in the minds of men or women and reveal it to the world. And return there I have, and I'm willing to plunge back and share what I have discovered, if you will follow, if you dare. But first, let us look up and out, crane the necks of our fancy, which hold up the heads of our curiosity, which contain the eyes of our scientific wonder, from the small to the big. It is a simple fact, ladies and gentlemen, that 90 to 99% of the universe is simply unaccounted for. There's not enough matter detectable to hold the universe together, seemingly, and yet hold together it does, even though it is expanding at a speed of over 300 miles an hour. Still, it holds together, and yet there are huge patches of white canvas in the cosmic portrait. In the bowl of pan-galactic potato soup, there are few potatoes, very little soup, and no bowl at all. Theories have been expounded over the years to explain this emptiness, this absence. Weakly interacting massive particles, or WIMPs for short, massive compact halo objects, or MACHOs for short, or weak and natural kinetically energized radioactive spheres, or WANKers for short, but all of these have fallen just that, short. In 1978, the Norwegian particle physicist Uns Bent posited that it was a clear case of theft. He stated that his equations had failed to identify a specific culprit, but somebody or something has obviously been helping themselves or itself to a large part of the universe and making off with it. And that someone or something he theorized was someone or something from another universe who or that was building an extension to his or its universe and couldn't be bothered providing for his or its own material. All fascinating theories. All, I would like to suggest, wrong. It is at this stage that I want to provide a suggestion as to what may have really happened vis-a-vis the dearth of stuff in our universe. And in order to do that, I must ask you to foreshorten the gaze of the ocular organs of your curiosity and return back with me to the world of the small. Back to the smallest thing ever, thing. As I emphasized before, the entity thing is infinitely small. So small that there are only 4 of its properties that I am physically capable of talking about. The first property is the fact that it is called thing. The second property is the fact that it is infinitely small. The third property is the fact that it is impossible to talk about any other property of thing except for one more. The fact that I am unable to talk about any other property of thing except for one more is due to the fourth property I can talk about, the above mentioned one more, which is that thing is so small that any energy expended in describing other properties other than the 3 mentioned above and this fourth one I'm describing actually affects thing in a cataclysmic way. And that is that thing's smallness combined with the energy needed to describe any property of it that is more complex than the 4 basic properties I am describing to you now, means that the energy expended overwhelms thing, so that as a mental concept, it disappears completely. It ceases to exist. Now, those are the 4 properties I can talk about. If I try to talk now about a property more sophisticated than the 4 mentioned above, for example, the fact that what was I talking about? Oh, yes, thing. Yes, as you could see, I was unable to enunciate the words because I didn't know what I was talking about, because in trying to describe a more subtle property other than the 4 I described earlier meant that the energy I was expending in the electrical activity produced by my brain temporarily destroyed the concept the energy was generated to describe. I was trying to describe something that did not exist. Indeed, as soon as I discovered thing, because of the energy expended by my brain in finally formulating the parameters of its existence, it ceased to exist until I stopped thinking about it, and then as soon as I remembered what I discovered, naturally it ceased to exist again, and so on. This went on for 23 years. Eventually, I have succeeded in being able to think about thing in its entirety only by sitting in a very cold bath. Actually describing thing to others is far more difficult. Indeed, so far I can only describe thing in a very general sense, or more specifically, describe its 4 most simple properties by devising blocking techniques. I am able to talk about thing in this non-specific sense now by using the blocking technique of thinking about something else as I do so. Jacques Chirac's left arm, actually. When describing the 4 aspects above, I have to think of 2 things at once, Jacques Chirac's left arm and Jacques Chirac's right arm. When describing anything more complex than the 4 aspects I listed, such a level of cognitive attention is required that it becomes impossible to think about one of Jacques Chirac's thumbnails, let alone both his arms, and then the energy overwhelms thing's conceptual entity and it ceases to exist. Similarly, if I try to write down properties of thing other than the 4 I've described, I take up my pen, what was I trying to write? Oh yes, about thing. As you saw, I was unable to write anything down. The same cancellation through expansion of energy process took place. And so this is, as far as I can describe it, the entity I have discovered, which is called thing. So what has thing to do with the absence of matter in the universe? Well, what was I? Oh yes, thing. Well, this is the tricky part. It does have something to do with it, because what? Oh yes, thing. Anyway, you see my difficulty in expressing exactly what thing's part in the phenomenon of dark matter is. All I can say is that it all makes for a very convincing argument, I can tell you. Well, I can't, but it does. That concludes my lecture for today. I will now take questions. Any questions? Takes a lot of, come on. There must be some questions. I can't believe there are no questions.